hi everyone. Thanks for joining this session. We'll be looking at the cyber risk landscape in Southeast Asia, and particularly how Japanese companies operating in the region can be mindful of the security compliance landscape and some of the best practices, both from the region and also globally. So Alex, if you could just run through what we're going to present today so that the audience is aware of what we have in store.
Sure, thanks Thomas. Today we'll go through some introductions from each Thomas and I, our companies, what we do. We'll cover the Southeast Asian threat landscape. We'll go into a bit of a deep dive on the particular cyber threats that it's facing. We'll go into some best practices, so navigating global frameworks and dealing with local regulations. And then we'll finish with a wrap up, we'll do some key takeaways and some Q&A as well. So a little about me. My name is Alex Raso. I'm originally from Australia, but I've relocated to Bangkok in the last year. I worked in the cybersecurity space for a few years in Australia, ended up relocating here and bringing what I've learnt to Bangkok. So when I got here, I started Raso Cyber. It's a small consultancy that specialises in assessments and audits. We look at particular key services that businesses need: cloud backup, DMARC, email protection, that sort of thing, to get businesses going quickly in a space that's evolving very rapidly. So, we like simple language, simple playbooks, key, easy wins, and building a security practice that's going to last a long time. So I'll pass it back to Thomas, and he can talk a little bit about his company, Anzenix.
Cool. Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. Anzenix, we're based here in Tokyo, Japan, but we operate around the Southeast Asian region, advising both investors and enterprises on risks and opportunities, both in terms of cybersecurity and also in terms of what we call integrated intelligence. So we can provide training, deep dive briefings, and also investigations to help with everything from due diligence to executive crisis management planning, and also get companies ready for what's in store when they expand across the region. So let's get right into it, Alex. Where you are in Bangkok, what does the cyber threat landscape look like, and how does it compare to where you were previously in Australia?
Cool, thanks Thomas. So here's the picture from Bangkok today. Scams are really the big volume problem. They proliferate constantly across various different social media apps, and the incidence rate is very high. Just last year, losses due to those scams ran into the high hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's the background noise that basically all employees constantly live in day to day. So it bleeds into work chat, emails, payments, everything to do with work. Ransomware attacks aren't quite spiking, but they're very steady. Critical services like healthcare constantly under threat from them. So, and then you've got attacks across the region very similar to that pattern. Scams really drain the most money. Business email compromise, investment fraud, romance baiting, account takeovers showing up every day of the week. So some of these come from organized scam centers in the region, which we can talk about a bit later, which tends to create a cross-border kind of spillover. So you have basically victims in one country, and then you've got criminals in the other. So governments, they're starting to, take a bit of action, particularly here in Thailand. For example, they just announced a legislative change to make getting SIM cards much harder, which will require much more stringent, heavier ID checks to stymie fraud. Also, net banks are now required to have transfer limits of 50,000 baht per transaction, which is based on the customer's risk profile, of course, but it's a nice little attempt to curb financial fraud. So how does that compare to Australia? Well, the threat types, they tend to overlap, but scams are still very common, especially in Australia amongst the older generation. But visibility on the numbers and the types of these attacks is a little sharper due to reporting just being of higher quality. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre logged roughly one report every few minutes last year, and it handled more than about 1,000 incidents in the year. So for Australian businesses, again, it's a very similar view. The repeat problems are email compromise, online banking fraud, supply chain hits, that sort of thing. State actors are commonly identified in some of these attacks. We see some state actor activity here in Thailand and Southeast Asia at large, but the public detail on them is a little more sparse. And when Australia gets hit by a foreign actor, the ACSC really lets everyone know about it. So that's my side. But Thomas, how about on your side? You're based in Tokyo, but you're very active across the region, as you said. So what should Japanese companies be most aware of?
Yeah, so I think it's important first to zoom out. And when you're talking about the Southeast Asian region, you need to acknowledge it's a very diverse region, many countries, different levels of maturity across the board. But I'd say when you're talking about the risk landscape, there's sort of two layers. So one is the attack surface, and the other is the sort of threat environment. And if we look at the attack surface, so you've got the major trend, which is digital transformation across the board. Even in markets like Singapore, which are already very economically advanced and has high digital penetration rates, small and medium-sized enterprises there are also going through digital transformation, just like here in Japan. Then, of course, that isn't just looking at digital transformation in terms of consumer tech or enterprise tech. We're also talking about government services as well. And very often, also observed here in Japan, is when you have these big leaps in digital transformation, very often security is not really taken into high consideration. And we can see that, for example, last year there was a huge ransomware attack targeting a data center shared by 230 government agencies in Indonesia. And due to the ransomware attack, these services were disrupted. And this has now prompted major calls in the Indonesian government to, of course, improve cyber posture. In addition, when we talk about the attack surface, you also need to look at the trend that's very relevant to Japanese companies. So increasing digitalization of manufacturing. One point to note is that actually several Japanese companies have had their local subsidiaries across Southeast Asia fallen victim to cyber incidents, and oftentimes this does impact operations targeting the headquarters as well. And related to that, there's also trends, especially in countries such as Vietnam and places like Singapore, where there's this push for smart cities and connected devices and all this stuff. So again, you're just sort of increasing the attack surface. And then I'd say kind of one last point on that is the so-called tech stack is getting very complicated and diverse across the region as well. So you're not just dealing with American originated technologies and infrastructure services, but also those from China, those from other players. You have a whole stack of different outsourcing components like software outsourcing, hardware, etc. So I think managing third-party risk and that whole, let's say, third-party attack surface is also growing as well. And then when we talk about the threat environment and the threat landscape, so as you mentioned, of course, the scam epidemic is big and real, and also penetrates into the business environment too. And then, as you mentioned, you've got huge criminal organizations that are launching these scams, are also involved in other activity. You do have a lot of advanced persistent threat behavior, as you mentioned, most of these associated with certain states. And this can be everything from targeting telecom infrastructure to also, for example, the DPRK, North Korea, targeting cryptocurrency exchanges and stealing funds in order to raise money for the regime in Pyongyang. So there's a whole let's say diversity of different actors at play. Even because of the geopolitics, you have a lot of incidents and events in places like the Philippines too. And I would say overall, now thanks to AI, all of the threat actors are now finding much more sophisticated ways of targeting. So whether this is spear phishing in order to implement some info stealing, malware or ransomware, but also in terms of the actual attacks as well. And that's everything from more sophisticated fraud, disinformation campaigns, if we're talking about nation states, etc. So in short, the risk landscape is kind of getting more intense in the region. But maybe if you could go into just a bit more detail, because it's such a big problem about the sort of the scam economy in Southeast Asia, and why this should be of concern to Japanese companies operating in the region.
Yeah, for sure. So, very good question. It's the scam industry, especially in Southeast Asia, it's actually quite fascinating, very, very structured. So at the top, you have transnational crime syndicates based in special economic zones and border towns within Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos. So they lure workers in with fake jobs, they confiscate their passports, they force them to engage in various different kinds of scams, pretty much at an industrial scale. The objective is really just fast profit at all costs. So, around these hubs, you have like local power brokers, corrupt facilitators who basically provide protection of resources, logistics to these scam hubs. When government pressure builds up, the scam compounds will simply move, rebrand, they'll reopen under a new banner. So raids do help, but they're really just superficial solutions. So it's interesting because Thailand actually does conduct these raids now and tries to shut them down. So basically under that sort of protection layer, the outer layer, you've got the operational layer within. Floor bosses will push quotas, the social engineers work the scam chats, recruiters will find young job seekers, money mules move cash around. Some of them are willing criminals, but like I said, many are coerced into working. Again, police will arrest these low-level players, but then they'll be replaced very quickly. You've now got fraud as a service popping up. So these criminal groups are now developing fraudulent applications, tools to provide these scam organizations to then go out and scam at an industrial level. AI plays a factor in that because it dramatically reduces the barrier of entry and increases the volume of these attacks because a lot of their work can be automated. A lot of the cash runs through underground sort of banking groups and cryptocurrencies, so the money can cross borders very quickly. It makes it very hard to track this form of financial crime. So Thailand is in an interesting position. It's right in the middle. It's the epicenter of all this traffic, right? So police handle thousands of cybercrime cases every year. Losses reach to the hundreds of millions of dollars. The victims actually are more often than not just regular users, not just old people or young people, the average person who gets scammed. The good news is that Thai government is really making some efforts to crack down on this stuff. So they're working more with banks and telecom companies to block scam links, make scams harder to proliferate. And like I mentioned before, the Thai government even recently, I think it was February, they conducted these raids where they basically just cut off resources to these scam towns. So they will cut off internet and power to these scam towns, which is very interesting. So you might hear about places like KK Park and Shui Koko in Myanmar, parts of Sihanoukville in Cambodia, the Golden Triangle in Laos. These are all these scam hubs. So outside of those fences, you've got the Chinese fraud groups, and then the local facilitators across the region that move the money around. So very complex structure. But moving on from that, Thomas, you're the policy wonk. You love a bit of policy. What have you seen in as far as government response to these threats in the region from a policy perspective, and how do they compare to other countries across the region? Who's doing it best?
Yes, unfortunately, not every government can go in and raid scam compounds, and also the cyber threat actor landscape isn't just isolated to those types of groups. So across the region, there's definitely a lot of diversity in terms of the maturity of government responses, the type of legislation and regulation in place when it comes to cybersecurity and data protection. I think, as probably expected, Singapore is like the gold standard for the region, and I'd also argue it's probably one of the, let's say, within the top 10 globally when it comes to cybersecurity regulation and data protection. Very specifically as well, even in Singapore, if you're a cybersecurity service provider, you need a license to provide certain services. There's a certification regime in Singapore where you as an entity can actually, if you follow certain steps, you can have a sort of certification saying, we have cyber essentials in place. And now there's a new regulation which is a bit more advanced called Cyber Trust. This is actually based on the model from the UK of a few years ago, but the fact that it's been implemented in Singapore shows that the Singapore government does take this seriously. Then if we look at other jurisdictions in the region, so Vietnam is interesting because the model is a bit similar to what you see in mainland China, where the emphasis on cybersecurity is very much about keeping the data local, so data localization, data sovereignty, and there's a lot of crossovers between sort of public security, public order, and cyber. Whereas when we look at other markets in the region, so Malaysia, I think, is following the example of Singapore. Last year, there was a new cybersecurity regulation in Malaysia with a heavy emphasis on critical infrastructure owners and operators. So if you are operating in Malaysia, you do need to pay attention to those regulatory requirements. Otherwise, you will face consequences for non-compliance. Then I'd say, look, elsewhere in the region, when you look at countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, you have existing laws around data privacy, data protection, and cybercrime. However, I'd say that in all of these countries now, there is an evolving, political and legislative landscape. So I would expect new and emerging cyber laws and regulations to be coming soon from those jurisdictions. And then look, how does this compare on the global landscape? So I'd say the EU and Australia are probably some of the strictest regimes in the world in terms of compliance and security and data protection. In the US, you have very industry-specific types of rules and regulations. So, for example, HIPAA for healthcare, FISMA for the federal agencies, and then you have also other jurisdictions which it's a bit more light touch. And then if you look at as well how different governments are incorporating the role of the private sector. So I'd say in places like the US, the private sector is engaged but sort of at a distance. So you have public-private partnerships, you have information sharing organizations, but the government doesn't take too much of an intrusive role, even when an incident does happen. Whereas in jurisdictions such as the UK or Israel, for example, the government actually does have the right to go in and act more intrusively without having too many other, let's say, checks and balances involved. So you have more of a whole of nation approach to cybersecurity. And I'd say that's quite different to what you see in ASEAN, where, yes, you do have a lot of oversight of critical infrastructure, and you do have a lot of mention of public-private partnerships when it comes to the national or regional cybersecurity strategies. But I'd say by and large, the government isn't as intrusive or hands-on compared to the examples I made. And then the last point I'd say is, from what I see as well, is governments in the region aren't so proactive when it comes to cybersecurity. So you never hear about, for example, the Thai cyber forces infiltrating networks in another country. Maybe it happens, but you don't really hear about that as much. Whereas if you look at the US, UK, Israel, some European countries, Russia, China, etc., they have more proactive cybersecurity strategies where they tend to use offensive means more regularly. So kind of just to summarize, I think things are definitely changing in the region. You have ASEAN regional cybersecurity cooperation initiatives. You have a center of excellence for this in Singapore. Japan is actually getting more involved at the government-to-government level. So there's actually a Japan ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Center in Thailand, in Bangkok. ASEAN and other, let's say, large players such as the EU and the US are also cooperating as well to share all these different best practices. So I would expect in the coming months, and years, that there'll be much stricter regulation and more proactive cyber responses from governments in the region. So if we talk about what the government response is on the local level for one thing, but there's a lot of global existing cybersecurity frameworks. Alex, from your perspective, what have you seen as some of the more popular or commonly used cybersecurity frameworks in Southeast Asia?
Across the region, across the Southeast Asian region, probably the most common boilerplate framework would be the ISO framework. Most firms will anchor to ISO 27001 for their security and 27701 for privacy. And then they'll map, to the local laws or for whatever the client might demand for their security. Or, reporting to leadership, to a board, maturity tracking over time. Many teams use the NIST framework. For quick wins in the operations sphere, teams will translate the same NIST and ISO controls into their day-to-day policies to keep it all compliant. If the company is involved in taking payments, then PCI DSS will set the rules for that. If they sell or develop a software or SaaS product, global buyers are still asking for SOC 2 Type 2, which I'm seeing more and more frequently here. In terms of cloud, ISO 27017 and 18 are commonly used to measure preparedness. And some companies, still use IEC for operational technology and factory environments, of which there are a lot, especially in Thailand. This year, more organizations than ever are really mapping to NIST 2.0 governance categories, as they're the most straightforward to implement. PCI DSS 4.0 is pushing for more tighter scope and for stronger MFA, which is good. Third-party risk is starting to get real attention, supply chain attacks, that sort of thing, impacting that. Privacy and security teams are now treating impact and transfer procedure assessments as a normal part of their operations, not just side projects they have to do for a compliance or in the event of a breach, which is always good to keep ahead of those things. So, that's what I've seen. What you usually deal with on your end?
Yeah, from my side, if companies don't really have anything in place, I usually go first with the NIST CF cybersecurity framework, because that's quite a nice, easy framework to comply with. And then for more sophisticated companies, of course, as you mentioned, ISO 27001. But I deal more with financial firms, so you have very specific regulations in Singapore from the Monetary Authority of Singapore around technology risk management. It's not so much in Southeast Asia, but also in Hong Kong, you have the new Critical Infrastructure Bill and certain provisions from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the Security and Futures Commission. And recently, more inquiries from firms in the region looking to do business in Europe or partner with Europe, especially because of the current geopolitics. So more interest in NIS2 and DORA on the financial side. So if we flip it back, we've talked a bit about the policy and the frameworks. What would be your kind of high-level advice for Japanese firms that are looking to operate in the region, looking to comply? What sort of steps should they follow?
The easiest way to get started is really just to choose a baseline. So, ISO 27001 for your security and 27701 for your privacy is a great way to start. As a Japanese firm, you want to map your operations to Japan's Act on the Protection of Personal Information so that HQ is covered. And then you want to add country overlays on top of that as required. So, keeping in touch with local regulations. In Thailand, for instance, that would mean aligning to PDPA, for example. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. You want to keep the same sort of controls, and then you want to adjust your notices, timelines, breach steps to comply with whatever the local regulations are. So I'll go through, beyond that, I'll go through a checklist of sort of major points and things to watch out for. So I think I would advise companies to aim to build a minimal viable program in about 90 days' time to get you up to compliance for cybersecurity. Part of that is publishing a plain language privacy notice for each country that you operate in, so you're covered. You want to create a workflow to check your customer privacy rights, and then a playbook to follow in the event of any breach. Appointing a data protection officer is important, especially when it's required by law. You want to lock cross-border transfers with the right checks and documented transfer assessments, like I mentioned before. You want to update your vendor contracts to have minimum security requirements as well. Another important part is to remain adroit with your operations. So you want to run a control stack that can work across region. That involves a lot of basic stuff that you can pretty much apply across your organization. Means making sure that MFA is configured everywhere. Making sure that legacy protocols are disabled. Using endpoint detection across your organization. Having backups that you can quickly and easily restore, immutable if possible. You need any internet-facing systems must be patched on schedule that the business can live with. It's not too frequently, not too often. You want to keep logs very religiously to investigate any breaches you might have and comply with any local rules. And I can't stress enough, training. You must train your staff to spot scams and be prepared. What else? Being local, so translating all of your documentation and playbooks into whatever the local language is. Again, teaching those playbooks to your staff so they can spot scams. Lastly, testing. You want to make sure that what you built actually works. So, you want to do a tabletop exercise each quarter when you can, regular pen testing, keep evidence of those tests and track your metrics over time. Things like privacy right request closure time, time to detect breach, time to contain a breach, number of high-risk vendors that you maintain as well. And of course, if you want help with any of that, it's always good to partner with a local expert. So both my company, Raso Cyber, and Thomas's Anzenix can help you develop a security posture that gives you peace of mind and really kickstart that first 90 days. So beyond the stuff that I mentioned there, Thomas, what do you think are the best important things, global practices to adopt that I haven't mentioned?
I think you basically mentioned everything. I would just emphasize on the point about training, making sure it's local, making sure it's actually not just about click, security awareness training, that it's actually actionable, both on the operational level and also on the executive level. But yeah, I think you covered all of the major points, also emphasizing, like you said, core hygiene, like backups, MFA, etc. But okay, let's talk about, you talked about what is the best practice, but what are the implementation challenges? Like what do you see as difficulties that Japanese firms may encounter if they want to implement this at the local and regional level?
That's a great question. Most people think immediately it's the technology, the complexity of the technology that's the biggest challenge. I disagree. I think it really comes down to three things: people, rules, and money. So first is people. So that involves culture, company culture, social culture, and awareness. It's still a problem, especially in Thailand. It's worse for that. Many leaders still think that they aren't a target. Staff tend to feel silly about raising a near miss attack, which can let small issues snowball, especially if there are small vulnerabilities that aren't addressed. Sometimes security awareness training can be just a checkbox activity for compliance reasons. Often shadow IT will fill the gaps in a business operations because it feels more expedient, but tends to lead to more problems over time. So this can all be fixed with very plain English, plain language policies, testing, drilling your staff, short tabletop exercises that can involve adjacent departments like finance and operations, not just IT. So a bit wider across the organization as it operates. You really want to reward early reporting of any problems. So make it safe to say that something looks wrong with the organization. Gamification can dramatically help with that, giving back to your staff for their good behavior. Second thing is rules. So uneven regulation and legislation. So obviously this changes from country to country. We know that it's a new space, it's developing every day. So often the wording can be vague of these legislation and policies. So what happens often is that businesses don't have the mental bandwidth to keep pace with the technology. So it often can lead to compliance box checking, slow decision making. That's why picking a really strong baseline is important to build off of. So like your ISO 27001 or your NIST, and then roll it out across your organizational footprint. Of course, once you've done that, you need to make sure that you're mapping each local rule to your single control set so that you maintain consistency across the organization and you keep single source of truth playbook for your incidents and reporting as well. So you don't have problems where one region reacts in a different way to a breach that may affect another region. You want consistency. The last thing is money. So investment in cyber tends to spike after a breach, and then it tends to fade away after that once the problem's gone. So identity, email security and backup, will often go underfunded, while things like, the latest AI tool will get all the attention, right, and investment. On top of that, good talent is hard to retain and find in the first place. And then projects, if they don't have that talent to lead those projects, they tend to stall. So like for basic cyber implementation, you want to really just stick to budget rule of thirds. So, these are the three pillars: identity and access, email and endpoint, and backup and recovery. So those three pillars, if you have them covered, they will cover you through 90% of cyber threats. That simple approach will give you a really good head start. Now, is there anything I missed, Thomas? Anything you'd like to add that sort of fits into that thing?
Yeah, no, I just say I think it's important that the local entities should be able to back up and restore without support from the HQ or the regional HQ, because we've seen some cases where there was an over-reliance on support from HQ, etc. So having all the infrastructure you mentioned, but also with recoverability at the local level, I think is very important. And just to kind of cap off the discussion, I think a lot of security leaders and people in the industry complain that security shouldn't just be considered as a compliance exercise. How do you respond to such criticism? And any comments around that?
So the criticism is fair. Security shouldn't be a paperwork contest or a box ticking exercise, but compliance actually does really sell, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. So, in many deals, one of the first hurdles you might come by is a questionnaire or a request to see your ISO certification or your NIST certification, your SOC 2 certification. And if in many cases, if you're not appropriately prepared to meet that request ahead of time, you will fall behind, right? If you're not prepared, you could lose that business. So compliance, it makes companies more competitive because they can get ahead of other companies who have been a bit more lax in their approach to maintaining their security certification. So it really does help to show a client or a customer that it proves that you can meet the security baseline, you can respond to threats, you can keep regulators at bay, you can keep the trust of customers. So there's many good points for it. So the other important thing to note is that really it frankly just cuts the risk of you getting fined. Having clear policies, tested controls, evidence that you've taken steps to improve your protection, it will help you reduce penalties in the long run. If you handle personal data or any payments, it's not optional. You need to have this stuff. It will lead you into trouble if you aren't prepared. And in the long run, honestly, it's just going to protect your revenue and it's going to protect your reputation. And then really, you shouldn't just stop at getting the certificate. Use compliance as a springboard for a higher standard of security. You want to use a single control set, like a good solid security framework. Again, map it to local laws and client needs, and then measure your outcomes. So important things to keep in mind, always multi-factor. You want to check your phishing, click rate, time to detect, time to restore. All these metrics are important to track that performance. So you want to treat it really as an opportunity to improve, not just to tick the box and get ahead. So, let's go over some key takeaways there, Thomas. What do you have to say, I guess, for security practitioners in this space? What are the main things they should keep in mind?
Yeah, so I think, maybe there's a slide with a summary as well, but what I'd say is that overall, as we discussed, it's a rough neighborhood. Everywhere in the world, cybersecurity is an issue. I think we can all agree on that. But I think given the diversity of the region and the sort of greater geopolitical and economic context of the various different countries, it does make operating there a bit more complex, especially when you consider all the different language and cultural contexts on top of that as well. I think as we mentioned, a huge one here is preparation and planning, everything from having the right policies and programs in place, testing them, etc. Having a good security culture that you can enforce. And I think, from our side, we'd say empowering the local teams, whether it's the operational staff or the local security leaders, I think is very, very important. And then the main one, I think, which is a common topic globally, but I think needs to be more of an issue in Southeast Asia because of the various different components and complexities, is third-party risk management. So adequate due diligence of vendors, suppliers, etc., even employees if you're concerned about insider threats. And just making sure that you have programs in place, whether it's from consultancy side or using various technologies to manage that third-party risk. And the last one, I think, is just like make sure you have backups, because so many companies in the region that got ransomware that didn't have backups. So I think that would be the main point. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, it'd be great to hear more about how can we actually help these firms in the region. So I'll let you sort of cap it off with that, Alex.
Yeah, sure. Keeping it pretty brief, I can help out with audits, assessments. I can consult on organizational changes to help you get to a point of compliance and to go even further. So I can handle implementation and integration of various different SaaS solutions to address the gaps that the assessment will uncover, and then help you, get to that point of excellence. Main things really are cloud backup, email protection, security monitoring and management, basic stuff. I can also help with policy creation and, things that are required to meet compliance, incident response plans, that sort of thing, especially where Thai law is concerned, can help you be compliant. How about yourself, Thomas?
Sure, yeah. Maybe you can share our email addresses as well so that everyone can get in touch with us if they have any questions. I just rounded off saying that, I guess for Japanese companies, we'd focus a lot more on the training and educating of the executives and the different stakeholders, whether that's regional management, local management. We can conduct those sort of trainings and workshops and crisis management simulations here in Japan at the local level. Also, we have capabilities of providing more technical training to software development, cloud infrastructure teams, etc. And that can also be done across the region too. And I think another point to emphasize is between us, we have a strong network of partners outside of the cybersphere. So law firms, which is very important for compliance, audit firms, physical security partners, and also vendors. So neither of us, at least for now, have developed our own proprietary solution. So we use a handful of different vendors to actually conduct our services. So we're open and happy to work with different vendors and other types of partners as well across the region. So yeah, just to cap it off, thanks everyone for your time today. Apologies again for the technical disruptions, and we appreciate your patience. We're happy to meet you, get in touch with us anytime. ありがとうございました。ขอบคุณครับ
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Okay, yeah, I think we can maybe do questions.
If you have any questions, let us know.
Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion. It was pretty interesting. So I have this question. What do you think are the best, top 3 steps what to do in South Asian countries with developing security systems to make it better?
You mean developing secure systems themselves, or developing security?
Make security better.
Oh, make security better.
Yeah.
So I'm very much favor everything from the government, whatever, fine, but I think the private sector needs to take initiative. So it has to happen at the company level. You can't, if you really take it seriously, it needs to be done from the company level, depending on what industry you're in. So I think unless you have buy-in from the management, nothing's going to happen. And I think one key aspect of that is, again, it really depends on the industry. But let's say if you're developing software in the region, making sure that your engineers are aware of best practices when it comes to secure software development, cloud security, having DevSecOps, all of these kind of, let's say, more common, security standards in place. For other industries and sectors as well. For example, I didn't mention it, but in the manufacturing space, obviously OT, operational technology security, is a huge area when it comes to critical infrastructure. So systems around power, energy companies, those types of critical infrastructure systems. Globally, there's a shortage of specialists. but especially in Southeast Asia, and especially given how much investment there is into critical infrastructure, everything from data centers to new train lines to new power generation infrastructure. And my point on that is then you need to train those engineers, because you can't just have a cyber person who becomes like a civil engineer. You need to train the civil engineers in these security best practices. Same thing with software developers, right? A lot of software developers don't necessarily come from the security background that have that security mindset, right? It's like ship, right? And then the security comes in and this was a fight between security and developers, right? Whereas I think it's like you're going to have the same thing when it comes to infrastructure. But to kind of answer your question, so I think it has to come from the initiative of the companies themselves. They need to realize without having the government to tell them first. But of course, if you have the regulation, which has to be mandatory, because otherwise no one's going to do anything. That's why, even for us, like doing anything around security compliance in the region can be tough sometimes, because many companies are like, well, I don't have to do this, right? Which is why I focus on the financial sector, because most of them do, right? If they're licensed in certain jurisdictions. Whereas for a lot of other industries, not just here in Japan, but across the region, they don't necessarily have that same level of urgency when it comes to implementing security or having, even like a ISO 27001 certificate, right? It doesn't really mean much to them unless unless it's kind of driven from management, because there's no government telling them, oh, you need that for many, many industries. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Really good.
Alex, anything to add?
Just to add to what you said, obviously in a perfect world, it'd be top down and bottom up, driving towards security compliance. But obviously that's very few and far between examples that exist of that. So in its place, you really need to have a management or director level led security push. And hopefully that comes in tandem with legislative or regulatory changes by the government of that particular country. Because really, that's the biggest, stick to wave in terms of getting people, to improve their security compliance, is basically threatening them with fines or sanctions or whatever. So the strong government response, strong regulation and legislation, and then obviously, board or director level push within the organization for cybersecurity update, and methods to drive adoption. So that could include gamification. It could include relevant training, rewarding good behavior within an organization. Very important stuff, even before you get to technical solutions. This sort of stuff will build a bedrock for improvement of a security posture.
Okay, one more question.
Thinking about the development of AI, the deepfake is getting a difficult question, the biggest problem right now. And some companies might be having a big issue of deepfake. The people, the top management, the deepfake of the top management is posted on the internet, and the CEO may say, I'm going to buy this company to manipulate some share price, for instance. So that kind of things is happening everywhere nowadays. How far we should do, and what we can do to prevent. No, we can't prevent deepfake anymore, but what can we prevent? What can we do to minimize the risk or minimize the damage?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's becoming a huge issue also in Southeast Asia. In fact, even at the government level, there's been a few scandals as well. From my perspective, Alex, feel free to chime in afterwards, but I think that, there are certain solutions which are trying to help detect. There's a few companies I know in this space doing that, but again, I think the main thing is question everything. So, if you see something that doesn't look quite right, immediately, call the person, make sure it's the right number, right? Or even request an in-person meeting to verify. That's kind of the irony, is you kind of need to go through more these analog tactics And of course, maybe really, really sophisticated state-level hackers may like hack the guy's phone, and then you call them, and then they've already manipulated the voice or whatever. I mean, these are all scenarios which are potentially plausible, but at the same time, again, when it comes back to education, a few years ago, security awareness training was like, oh, if you receive this email, it might be a phishing email. Don't click the link. Whatever. Now it could be, oh, your boss is FaceTiming you, right? How do you, and then it's asking for this urgent request, right? Like this is the new sort of like phishing vector. So, and then it's like educating stuff on, okay, so, after the call, what do you do? Like, what are the other contact methods you have with the boss to verify? Do you have a pre-existing kind of like a safe communication channel, this kind of stuff? So it's a very big issue. And I think when it comes to a lot of the regulation and the laws, they're so far behind, right? Even the recent cybersecurity laws of whatever, like 2 years ago, they don't really consider this, right? So I think the only way that you can combat that is having this like very suspicious culture, but that goes against a lot of, I think, company instincts where they want like fast results, business, move fast. Whereas like if everyone has to step back, be suspicious. I mean, people complain about MFA, and now you want them to like every time their boss calls them to like do these, So I think with those kind of things, it might come to a scenario where only key decisions are done in person, right? Like I think that will probably be the trend. It has to be in person, in the room with the person face to face. Otherwise, it's not kosher. Anything to add, Alex?
Just again adding to what you said, I think awareness is the biggest defense against the proliferation of AI, people leveraging AI for scams. Teaching staff how to spot scams. I think there's probably a big gap in the market right now for security awareness training to do with AI cybersecurity. I know a lot of really decent providers out there do really good gamified security awareness training. Mimecast is one, Know4 is another. But as to how much their content is kept up with the AI battleground right now, can't really speak so much about it. So I think always training staff, having a zero trust culture, very strong way to keep those attacks away from your organization. Have multiple verification checks for any decision-making, financial transactions. Like Thomas said, use an analog method to do so, 2 or 3 methods if need be. Because a lot of that second layer of authentication is already being spoofed. So, hacking tool organizations produce like OTP bots that can they can spoof the one-time passwords that people get in SMS or so on. Voice cloning is a real thing as well. So it's like that second layer of authentication is now being tested. So having something even further removed from that environment makes verification more secure. So again, awareness, main source of defense for this stuff. Training how to staff how to spot scams, and then developing security infrastructure of zero trust that gives you a method to authenticate communication without any chance of being breached.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions. And just to add from my side, you can always look for Luminary for security training. We're actually releasing the gamified security solution pretty soon. So the October is going to be a public demo, and the full solution should be released around January, February. We already have a couple of big companies looking for pilot projects. So please stay tuned for news on our gamified solution as well. All of us can work together with
we'd love
making a better cybersecurity.
Use you as a vendor.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Thomas.